Good morning, everybody. As you're slowly filtering in, we'll give you a 30 seconds or a minute because we know it takes time for that connection to click through. I always give it till 2 minutes past. For those of you that have been on webinars with me before, you know that I wait for 2 minutes past just in case there's anybody whose clock is a minute or so out. And then it's really annoying when you've missed the very beginning of a webinar. So, morning, everybody. Hope you're all well on what for me is a nice sunny morning. Apologies if it's not quite so sunny for wherever you are this morning. Right, okay, it's 2 minutes past, so that means I'm officially allowed to start. Hooray. Morning. Welcome to the first of our autumn series of webinars being run by the CRA. Hope you're well on this Thursday morning. My name's Julia. I'm the head of outreach at the Charity Retail Association. And hopefully you're going to really enjoy the session this morning. This is September's edition. We've also got October, November and December to cover the whole of the autumn as recorded webinars that are free for our members to attend. The webinar this morning is going to be on creating a net zero action plan. And before I hand over to Beth and Adam, I'm just going to run through the kind of boring bits and pieces in case you've forgotten, because it's been a while since you've been on a webinar. So you're in the kind of attendee viewer mode. So we can't see or hear you, but don't panic, you can still interact with us. So at the bottom of your screen, there should be an icon to click for chat, so you can communicate with us in the chat box. If you have any problems, if you can't hear anything, if the screen's breaking up, my colleague Kelly is on the line as well, so you can just message her directly in the chat box. Beth and Adam will be doing a Q&A at the end, but as the presentation goes through, if there's any questions that you think of, please put them in the Q&A box. Watch and see what other people are posting as questions, because if you like that question or you would have asked that question, you can upvote it, and then we'll kind of start with the most popular questions and go through and try and get as many of your questions kind of answered off as we go through the session. Hopefully that all makes sense and everybody's okay with that. Right, enough from me. Let's hand over to the actual speakers, because that's who you've come to hear from today. So I'm going to hand over to Beth from SCVO, and yeah, hopefully I'll see you guys later. So Beth, if you're okay, over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Julia, and thanks very much for inviting us to join you this morning. I am also joining from sunny Glasgow, so if any else of you are in Glasgow, hopefully you're enjoying a wee bit of the fresh air after it feels like a week and a half of solid rain, so it's nice to have the sun. I'm going to just kick off and introduce myself and Adam very briefly. So I think I'm from SCVO, the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations. We're the membership body for the voluntary sector up here in Scotland, and we're a sister organisation to NCVO, NICBA and WCVA. So if you're in other parts of the country, those are our kind of sister charities. And Adam's joining me from Small 99. Adam and I have been working together really closely over the last year or so on some resources to help organisations think about their kind of approach to net zero. So I'm the kind of voluntary sector person, and Adam's your net zero expert. So he'll take you through that part. I'm going to just kick off with a couple of slightly more interactive bits. So we're going to do a Menti to get us going, just so we can understand a little bit more about who's on the call and perhaps any action that you've already taken. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully people are familiar with Menti, but if you can, please go to menti.com on your browser and pop in that code there, 68285343. Then you should hopefully join our Menti and be able to vote. So I'll just wait for a wee second while people do that. I'm seeing people joining at the bottom. That's brilliant. I'll wait for that little thumb at the bottom to get up a little bit higher, and then we'll move on to the first question. Okay, we're up to 10. Maybe another, let's see if we can get another few joining in. Once we get to 15, I'll move to the first question. Brilliant, fantastic, that's great. See you all there. Right, let me move my controls out of the way. Okay, so our first question this morning is just a sort of a general one about why are you interested in climate and net zero? And we've put a few options there. So part of your organisational mission, important to customers and people you support, important for staff and board, committed to net zero targets as an organisation, and important to funders. So it just gives us a feel for the kind of the reasons that people are joining us. That's great. So range of answers there. So the organisational mission and the importance to staff and board are the two biggest ones. So that's great for us to see. And nice to see that it's such a high number of organisations with it as an organisational mission, actually, because a lot of the conversations we've been having with more socially focused charities has been about how do you align net zero targets and climate action with a mission that maybe feels more socially focused, and that sort of slightly false distinction between those two areas of work, but it's really great to see that number's high. So I'll move on to the next slide, which is about how confident you feel about your organisation's approach to net zero just now. So if you feel very confident, if you can go for strongly agree, and if you don't feel confident, strongly disagree. Okay, we're not seeing the answers coming through there. I'm sorry about that. That seems to be a wee glitch in the Menti. If you keep on answering, and I'll go when Adam's talking, I'll go offline and see if I can fix that. So I'll jump on to the next question because there's obviously a wee glitch there. Apologies for that. And then the last one, this is a free text one. So this is if you can just use the box to type in any actions that you've already taken in your organisation, so we can get a feel for any actions that you've already taken. There we go, that's them coming through now. So changes in procurement, moving to district heating, that's interesting. Upping the amount of recycling, changing suppliers and products, lighting, heating, energy efficient lighting, solar and biomass, recycling, net zero working groups, green team, brilliant, generally environmentally minded, somebody's not done any yet, reusable bottles, a full footprint map with scopes 1, 2 and 3. If that's language you're not familiar with, Adam will pick up on some of that as we go through. That's great. Get more use in hybrid cars, biodegradable consumables, incremental steps. Fantastic, that's great. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop the share on that just now. So I think we can see from that there's obviously quite a bit of action that some organisations have taken, some people perhaps more confident than others. I think as Adam's going to pick up just now and take us through some of the detail around, what do we mean by net zero and what are the main buckets and so on, we'll begin to see that there's probably much more that organisations can do than they maybe realise. Often, actually, what we've found is that organisations have done more than they think, and it's part of this work is about recognising progress and being able to talk publicly about it. And then there's lots of stuff around the edges of the core sort of carbon reduction that are also really important. And I'll pick up on some of that sort of broader climate action when I come back on and join you. But I'm going to hand over to Adam now to take us through the kind of formal presentation part. After that, I'll come back on and talk a little bit about some of the resources that we've developed to help organisations, which hopefully are relevant to you, whether you're based in Scotland or not. And then we'll open up for the Q&A after that. So I'll hand over to Adam now. Thanks.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Love to see you all. Yes, really good kind of ideas coming through there. Quite a lot of advanced stuff as well, which is really exciting. Always a big fan of seeing district heating. It's one of those things that I get very excited about. I'd like to nerd out. So please do share any information in the chat if you on your experience of that. What I'm just going to do is I've got a set of slides to run through here, and what I'm going to do is we're going to start off with a bit of the kind of the big picture stuff. So what is sustainability is kind of the real big question. And then we'll go down and narrow into some of the more operational elements of, as Beth mentioned, scopes 1, 2, and 3. What does that look like? And then finally, we'll end up on some actions to go, well, actually, here's the things that you can do towards the end. So if we look at just the broader picture here, over the past 800,000 years of why we're talking about net zero, well, we start to see that CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere have really shot up in the past kind of this large blip. And so while there has been a natural cycle of the CO2 emissions in the atmosphere, we are exiting this quite rapidly at the end, and we're beyond what the normal peak's been at around 300 parts per million. We are currently at around 420 parts per million in terms of that atmospheric concentration of CO2. What that means is that we're actually exiting this sort of safe zone, and we need to start acting and adapting. And that's why we're seeing net zero terminology really come through so much and from multiple directions recently. You see that safe climatic zone in the middle, that blue bit. Well, we're already at kind of 1.2 degrees, and we're starting to see the impacts of that with extreme weather. And over the past 150 years, we've seen, again, that 1.1 degrees, 1.2 degrees really come through in terms of the warming. Now, what that really means for the United Kingdom and for your organisation is that we are starting to see more extreme weather everywhere. These impacts are not equal. It's going to impact different regions and different communities in different ways. So, for example, for myself and Beth, based in Glasgow, we're going to see a lot wetter winters. We're going to see a lot drier summers. In the southeast, it might just be that it's going to be drier overall, and therefore things like flooding are going to be more impactful, and we're going to see droughts as well. And that's going to then have impacts on your operations, which we'll come to shortly. The main thing is that it's destabilizing, and that we're starting to see this predictability of climate not really be there anymore, and therefore we need to start take action to adapt to that and to mitigate some of those risks. On that risk, this is a really good article that was in the Financial Times last month, I believe, where they had over the past two months or so, it really showed that less rainfall than normal and that more rainfall than normal in terms of the averaging, and the impact that had on farms, where they said that they were in the lap of the gods. The farmers were really having issues with harvesting the grain, and it was happening in a really local kind of area. This wasn't a farm on the other side of the world. This was in the UK. And there's a great quote in there that really showed and tied up for me that how climate really impacts on individual organizations as well, is that they were using the heaters to dry the bread grain that was too wet because of that extreme rainfall further in the year, but they're running them on gas and diesel. That was then adding costs as well as, carbon emissions to their operations at around 10% overall in order to run those, which is then causing them to be slightly less resilient as an organization due to the increase in kind of inflation costs. So what does that mean for you? Well, this is where we start looking at climate risk, really, and this is an operational risk for your organization, and building in that resilience is really key. We saw last year, or earlier this year, sorry, that some heavy rain that happened during summer really disrupted road and rail travel due to that heat wave. So we had a kind of a period of heat, extreme heat. So it was about 26 degrees, I think, for 3 weeks in Glasgow. And then suddenly we had a lot of heavy rainfall shortly after that. That caused a lot of disruption to road and rail. The question here really being, can your organization adapt to that? Where is your stock coming from? Where are your staff coming from? What does that look like in terms of risk, and how can you start adapting? Interestingly, so a lot of the smaller businesses I speak to who might be importing things from China are also starting to see this as an operational risk, where last year, one of the rivers dried up due to drought, which meant two main things. One, there was no hydropower to power the factories that were producing the goods, and any goods that were already produced couldn't be shipped because the rivers were too low to put cargo shipping on. And therefore, smaller organizations are really struggling and starting to see this, that if they're importing a lot of goods to sell online or kind of in retail shops, they're starting to find that that's a real risk to their business, is that, well, what if they can't get that stock anymore? We also saw that this year in the Panama Canal, where droughts again started to have knock-on effects with the supply chain internationally, in a similar way to that we saw with COVID, and especially when the canal was blocked, the Suez was blocked. So the questions really to ask here are, can staff get to work? Are they going to be too hot or too cold when they get to work due to extreme weather? Or can you get your goods through due to disruption? And this is where I saw in the chart that came up, circular economy, someone mentioned there was an award-winning circular economy. I think that this is where we start to see the real practical benefits of circular economy coming through in a fantastic way. This is the reason for that, is that climate action really means climate resilience. So if you look at something like solar panels being put on the premises, that's going to help directly reduce energy bills, reducing materials from kind of or reusing or sourcing materials from local supply chains is going to really protect against that international kind of those shocks. I was at a Circular Glasgow talk yesterday evening, where there was someone who was taking old rope and fishing nets from the west coasts of Scotland and then turning that material into plant pots. And, that's a free resource and it is effectively pollution that they're then turning into this entire supply chain, and then now supplying people like Waitrose and some of the biggest distributors of plant pots or plants in Europe from that kind of waste resource. So rethinking the challenges there. Planting trees as well can be contentious, but if you're doing it domestically, especially in your local area, it can provide a lot of shelter and reduced kind of health impacts. And things like cargo bikes and electric bikes in local areas can avoid those fuel price increases on diesel vans, and can help you navigate and deliver perhaps areas that are more affected by flooding locally than diesel vans can. Just some examples of this. So there was a hospital in South Wales that started saving £1 million a year, which was roughly double what they'd anticipated due to the solar panels they'd installed. They were actually producing much more power than they realised. Obviously, this is a really big site and it's a big financial spend, but it just shows that they can go off-grid for about 6 months of the year. Wales not exactly famous for its sunshine, but it's still effective and still worked for them. In Scotland, again, just leaning on a local example, the Rest Would Be Thankful is one of the roads that constantly is closed due to kind of landslides or disruption. They're actually planting a huge amount of trees on the slopes above that for the root systems to really secure in the land, to stop to kind of protect that and building that resilience and continuity. We also see quite a few councils are now turning to those electric vans turning away from vans and into electric cargo bikes for urban deliveries and urban sort of servicing, because it's saving so much money in terms of operational costs, and that while an electric cargo bike is quite expensive to buy up front, the actual operations of it mean that you make the savings back quite quickly compared to something like a diesel van or even an electric van, where the cost is still going to be quite high. So really the question here is, we're looking at what is sustainability, and I think this is the key 3 questions. Is often people say recycling. It might be about going plastic free, and it might be things like paper straws as a result of that, and really looking at the kind of the plastic and the recycling. But I think we need to think more deeply. This is really about the ability of your organization to sustain itself. It is called sustainability, and therefore that sustaining element and looking at every part of your organization and the operations here is really what's the important thing. Just to take a step back and look at some of the more nuanced language around net zero and do some jargon busting. We'll first look at what a carbon footprint is, and then we'll look at the kind of carbon neutral versus net zero. In terms of your footprint, so if you are being asked for this as an organization, I just wanted to give a bit of a flavor of what this will look like in both technical and non-technical ways. So in the technical sense, there are 7 greenhouse gases which your organization might be producing, which is going to be part of your carbon footprint. That is carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and then there are 4 F gases or fluorinated gases. You can see on the right-hand side, this is the global makeup of gases in the atmosphere, where there is why it's called a carbon footprint, is because carbon dioxide is the biggest one, methane being the second big chunk as well, especially agriculture is quite heavy producing in methane. And then nitrous oxide and fluorinated gases are quite a small part of that. However, not all gases are equal, and there is something called the global warming potential. And carbon dioxide has a GWP of 1. If you look at something like methane, that's around 30 times as bad. Nitrous oxide between 270 to 300 times as bad as carbon dioxide, and F gases are many thousands times as bad. So you start to see a kind of graph like this where there's a huge disparity in it. The reason I'm mentioning this is that if you may have, for example, air conditioning units, if you're doing quite a lot of cooling, if you've got a leaky air conditioning unit, you're going to be using quite a lot of F gases, and that might make quite a big part of your footprint, which is a bad side. The good side being that if you fix that, that's going to make quite a rapid reduction to your carbon footprint as well. So just being aware of what gases you might be consuming. So again, while we do see that kind of global makeup where carbon dioxide is a big chunk of it, it's not necessarily the whole picture. Don't worry too much about the different gases there and kind of knowing all the details, because there is this figure called carbon dioxide equivalent. And this is where it really is important to understand the difference between net zero and carbon neutral, which we will come on to. But carbon dioxide equivalent is the one figure that expresses the impact of all greenhouse gases. It's not just carbon dioxide. It goes It combines everything and then provides this sort of metric for you to compare against. So if you're engaging with suppliers or you're engaging with anyone around this topic, always look for CO2e. If you see just CO2, it might mean they're only measuring carbon dioxide and it might be missing the bigger picture. An example of this would be that if you drive something like a Ford Fiesta, that will produce around 276 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per mile. That is taking into account everything within the kind of the engine turning on and all those gases being released. And certainly things like nitrous oxide are why we're seeing low emission zones and similar schemes come in, because that's part of the pollution. It might only be a very small slice of that emission, but it still adds to the overall kind of emissions. In terms of the footprint, there are 5 different buckets that we like to use to make it a little bit easier to kind of explore. We will come on to defining scopes shortly, and I saw that pop up earlier. But broadly, there are 5 different areas. So we've got energy and buildings, we've got travel or transport, we've got water, buy and sell, which is typically quite a big one, so your supply chain, and finally waste. And that includes things like how are your customers disposing of waste at the end of it as well. These 5 buckets make it much easier to look at your business and actually identify where emissions might be coming from, but also where you might be able to make the most savings and kind of make these operational efficiency improvements. When it comes to measuring your footprint, you might end up looking at the kind of the buckets in something like the image on the right-hand side here, where you've got those 5 different categories. But in terms of a more technical term, there are 3 different scopes that your footprint will fall into. Scope 1 being heating in vehicles. So if you are driving diesel vans around, or if you are using a gas boiler to heat your premises, that's going to be your Scope 1 emissions. Your Scope 2 is your purchased electricity. So where are you buying electricity from? And I won't go into the details of kind of the impacts of that, but that's roughly kind of where Scope 2 lands. And then finally, Scope 3 is everything else. So that's the things that you're buying, the things that you're selling, anything you're throwing away, and also includes the travel and transport of those goods to you and to the customer. In reality, if you did do an entire footprint, this is what you're going to end up looking like, where that Scope 3 is going to be a really big chunk, between 80 and 90% of your total emissions, where Scope 1 and 2 will either be quite minimal, so 10% or so, or it might be that you don't actually have any. And again, I won't go into the technical details just now of the cases for that, but there are very valid reasons why Scope 1 and 2 might be very minimal. In terms of just defining net zero versus carbon neutral sometimes only includes carbon dioxide. And again, there are different definitions out there, which is where it gets very complicated. Different organizations will accredit carbon neutral to different standards. Sometimes it will be carbon dioxide only. Sometimes it will include all of those gases we saw before. The main thing is, though, is that it is a demonstrator that you are offsetting equal to the amount that you are emitting and doesn't necessarily require reduction actions. So, for example, if you're emitting 100 tons of CO2, then you might be buying 100 tons of CO2 offsets, which then kind of mitigates, and you are neutralizing your impact there across the year. It's a great stepping stone on your path to net zero, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. To a certain extent, it does throw money at the problem, but it is a certified way to do that, in that it is going to cost you money to buy those offsets, but it's a great thing to do while you then work out and look at net zero in more detail. And there is the PAS 2060 accreditation for carbon neutrality there. It's increasingly under scrutiny, and the kind of the goalposts are shifting with it quite regularly, and I think they are starting to require more action in that. But it's just to kind of give a top level picture there. If you compare that to something like net zero, this is where the difference really stands out, that if you've got 100 tons of CO2, in order to claim net zero, you are only allowed to offset that remaining 10% of your emissions. It also includes all gases, so it's always across those greenhouse gases we saw earlier. But the main difference is that action is key. It includes those direct and indirect sources, so it does go beyond just potentially your operations. And that's the main kind of Scope 3 element, is that it does look into your impact and kind of operations in a much bigger detail, and requires a 90% reduction against the baseline year. So in this example, we can see that we've got 2019 as our sort of 100 tons of emissions. Well, we're going to need to reduce our footprint down to 10 tons before we can actually claim that net zero kind of accreditation or ability. And that's why it might take us a few years to do that. just from my personal experience, we do see that small organizations can make quite deep reductions very quickly. An 80% reduction over a couple of years is relatively possible, depending on your circumstances. So don't be too afraid of that 90% reduction. And I can talk about later some examples of that. But I think a good example that we saw earlier was, imagine taking a diesel van and turning that into an electric cargo bike. That isn't, even with the emissions from building the bike, you're still talking a 95 to 98% reduction in emissions from changing that. So it is sort of possible. I just wanted to also then outline some of the bigger picture stuff of why bother and what's happening, and why is net zero coming into the scrutiny outside of just the climate science. There's also a lot of legislative pressures that are coming here. I think that supply chain element, that scope 3, 80, 90% is really the biggest challenge for all organizations. If we look at someone like the NHS, they're requiring all suppliers to the NHS to have a carbon reduction plan from April 2024. Tesco's have got quite good public announcements around this, where they're requiring all suppliers to have started on a net zero pathway by the end of this year. They announced that during COP26. Looking at Scotland, there's conditionality coming through from Scottish Enterprise, so that any organisation applying for support packages of £10,000 or more are going to require a net zero or a carbon reduction plan by April 2024 as well. I think it's April, it might be a slightly different date. Also, just we're seeing councils increasingly require that alignment as well. And funding generally, we're starting to see that conditionality come through for grants. So just to explore and pick that Scottish Enterprise example slightly more, the latest date you can claim net zero by is 2045. Any support that's worth 10k or more businesses need that net zero plan of, well, actually, what are your scope of emissions and how you're going to achieve that 2045 date. Without that plan, you're not going to be able to get support. That plan requires scope 1 and 2 as a minimum. So that is essentially your gas and electricity bills, plus then any information on your vehicles that you might be driving or operating directly. It requires a 50% reduction by 2030 and a plan to do so, so quite ambitious there. And ideally, they recommend easily calculated scopes 3, things like business travel, any commuting that you're doing, and maybe any visitor travel as well will all be included in that. Just look at the NHS as well to give a bit of a roadmap of what the future looks like. I think this is a really useful timeline they've got on their website, where you can see April 2022, all NHS tenders had that 10% scoring for social value weighting, and that included the climate side. As of last year or earlier this year, actually forgetting what year we're in there, it's April 2023, they required contracts of more than £5 million to have that carbon reduction plan. And then a year later, they're requiring that of all of their procurement and all of their suppliers. So within 2 years, we've really seen them ratchet that up. Luckily, they are providing something into the future as well, where 2027, all suppliers need to have those public reported targets with a 2045 date as well, which interestingly, they've picked 2045 and not 2050 there. And that is reporting across all those scopes. And then some more requirements after that. So we can see that this isn't really going to go anywhere. Net zero is only something that's going to be ratcheting up due to the impacts of large organizations like the NHS, who are doing this. And I'd say people like Tesco's and the big supermarket chains and big organizations are producing these similar sort of roadmaps. Just in summary then, things are happening. We're starting to see more of the same conditionality and pressure coming. Impacts are starting to become multiple and indirect. So they're coming from not just one source. Pressure is hitting people from different organizations, either from a public procurement side, from a kind of private organization side and supply chain, as well as customer demand. The main thing is that action does help build that operational resilience. And I just wanted to run through some ideas of actions you can take. And I think we saw some great examples earlier, which would be great to kind of go through more detail. So I'm just going to spend 2 minutes or so running through these. Buildings and energy. So in terms of these 5 buckets, moving to a renewable energy supplier is obviously a really good thing. Imagine a lot of you have already done so if it is within your in your control. LEDs and time lights are a really good way of doing that. There's a light behind me that will only come on at sunset. So as soon as the sun sets, it automatically comes on. I don't have to turn it on at all. Engaging with your landlord and requesting change to providers is really key as well. I know that's not always possible, so do put in the chat if you've had any kind of questions or any challenges around that. It'd be really good to hear from you. Replacing oil and gas boilers, especially if you've got larger premises, is really key. And again, there is a difficulty there in terms of size and scale. Solar panels and wind turbines, again, quite big, but really important. EV charging points, I think, are great because that helps decarbonize your transport and visitor emissions as well. And again, it has that sort of knock-on effect. If we look at transport on the right-hand side here, we can see some of those electric cargo bikes I was going on about. Really starting to get an understanding of your vehicle data is actually quite an important first step before you even look at decarbonisation, just to build a picture up of what your emissions look like for transport. So how many miles are you driving a day, a week, a year, either in your own vehicle or in government vehicles, in organisational vehicles. Public transport's really key here. Even an electric vehicle is going to have a higher carbon footprint than something like a train or a bus, just because you've got more people who can get on them. Cycle to work scheme's really good. Kind of advocating vocally for public transport is really key as well. Electric bike rental schemes are a fantastic way as well of just getting people onto bikes and having what we call the smile effect. So typically, if you go, oh, do you want to buy an e-bike? People are going to say no because it's a lot of money. Well, actually, do you want to try an e-bike and just have a go for the day? And maybe we could arrange for people to cycle to work on e-bikes for a week just to see how people feel about it. It's going to be a much more effective way of changing behavior. Electric cargo bikes, if you are doing urban deliveries as well, really good idea, a really good solution. They've got a lot of benefits around costs and speed of delivery increasing as well. Supply chain and suppliers are a really big one. So this is a much kind of wider smattering. Checking bank and pensions is so important. We put it on here twice. I think kind of the financials of an organization are really key for if you're operating with certain kind of less ethical providers, that might be actually producing quite a lot of carbon emissions in terms of if they're financing oil and gas, so it can be quite important to move away from them. Just looking at your sustainability policies for your top 10 or top 3 suppliers is really key. Looking at your packaging, so if you are producing any goods or you're even kind of giving away goods in terms of carrier bags and looking at what that looks like, and buying refurbished office furniture and IT equipment also really key here. Moving on to waste, reducing the amount of packaging you're using, joining something like the flexible plastic fund so you can recycle more easily and kind of provide a resource point for collecting those flexible plastics. I know Tesco's, the Co-op, and I think Waitrose have kind of come into these. Circular economy, I think this is a huge one, which is its own webinar in its own right, but do other people need your waste? Are you sitting on actually a big resource that you could be selling to other businesses as a potential kind of supply? Thinking of those fishing nets, they're being washed up on beaches, and it's a free resource there to turn into an entire new product range, which is an incredibly potentially profitable way of doing it. Borrowing or renting equipment that's expensive is obviously a great way as well, especially kind of with waste, looking at IT infrastructure there. Do you need to buy new all the time? And reducing plastic usage as well. So obviously plastics are a big part of the wider problem. They might actually be quite a low carbon material, but it's a very damaging material in other ways. And repairing where possible as well. And this might be teaching you to suck eggs, but is actually quite often overlooked in terms of repairing and keeping things in process as long as possible. Just very quickly on water, I think looking at kind of harvesting rainwater, going back to that slide earlier where we saw the southeast was going to be very dry, it's really important to start looking at that and going, actually, how resilient is the local water supply? Can we make better use of what we've got? Saving water from kind of taps, toilets, laundry, using water-saving devices, just looking at your water usage is really important there, and engaging again with your water company to provide a bit of pressure on them to do better, really. And biodiversity as well. If you do have outdoor space on your premises, how are you managing that? Just very quickly as well on engagement, I think it's really key to write a list of everything that you've done and make sure you're putting it on your website and communicating. We saw earlier from that Menti about the amount of different ideas that people have had and the things that are already done. I would question how many of you have then actually put that into a single document or a single resource. Quite often, one of the challenges that we see with small businesses is that they've done loads of stuff, but they're not actually talking about it, which is a big challenge and a big barrier to other people taking action because they don't necessarily think it can be done. So make sure you're talking about these things and sharing it. Be transparent. And if you can't do something, please do say. No one is perfectly sustainable. Even big organizations aren't. They're going to have infrastructure and big challenges there that they can't overcome. So transparency is key at really just getting the conversation going. It's okay to say that you're not. Use your voice. So looking at transport, make sure you're advocating for bike lanes, for example. If you're saying that you can't use electric cargo bikes or people can't cycle to work, well, that's fair enough. In the short term, in the medium to long term, how are you engaging with your local areas to drive the change that you need to be able to do that? putting it on the kind of the agenda of the board. And I think we saw again on that Menti on that first slide that a lot of this is aligned to the organizational missions. Oh, slight animation quirk there. I'm going to stop there because I realise that I've run out of time. But I do have some other kind of ideas that it might be useful to discuss, depending on what questions come up. Back over to you, Beth.
Brilliant. Thanks, Adam. That was a whirlwind through a huge amount of information. So hopefully there's been nuggets in there that have been really useful for people. Feel free to start popping your questions into the Q&A now. What I'm going to do is just a couple of quick slides to share some of the resources that we've developed that hopefully can help you to take some of the actions that Adam has suggested. And then we'll come to the Q&A. So I'll just do about 5 minutes or so just to explain the resources that SCVO and others have been working on. So. Sorry, just a second. Are you getting the full screen there? There we go. Okay. So SCVO I'm here talking to you, but we're part of a much wider collaboration in Scotland where intermediaries such as ourselves and Social Enterprise Scotland and a number of others have been working together and with funders to look at where the gaps are around support for net zero for the sector. These are Scottish specific resources, but if they're useful for you, you're not based in Scotland, there's absolutely no problem with you using them, please do. And there's also reference to some of the support from NCVO and other people as part of them as well. What we've developed is a kind of toolkit called Growing Climate Confidence. It's called that because this is not only about net zero. Reducing your carbon emissions is a big and important part of it, but actually for our sector, a lot more of the value we might be able to add over time is around our ability to campaign and advocate, engage communities, and support with sort of adapting to the climate impacts that are already baked in. If you are thinking about developing a plan, I've kind of broken it down into you're probably going to have a number of different areas as part of that. So there's the engaging and learning part. So engaging and learning, that's both your internal staff teams, your board, but also potentially, customers in the shop, communities that your organisation supports more widely. So thinking about what you're doing around that engaging and learning piece, because if people are not yet on board with the need to take action, you need to bring them on board and you need to find ways to do that. There's all the piece that Adam's just talked about how do you actually reduce your emissions. There's a piece around campaigning and social justice. Everybody will be aware climate impacts are not experienced equally. And again, for lots of our organisations based in communities that are already marginalised or supporting communities that are maybe further away from other forms of support, they're also unfortunately likely to be the communities where the impacts are felt most severely. Same goes for globally. If you look at the global impacts of climate change, they won't be experienced equally. So being involved in those campaigns is really important. And then finally, adapting, and that's how do we cope with the stuff that already is happening. If your shop is in a floodplain, what does that mean? What does that mean for the future? How are we building in resilience as part of that? So you might want to think about a plan that can kind of cover those 4 different areas. You can go to climateconfident.scot. It's a website. It looks like this. I'm not going to take you through all of the website because that would be very dull. Hopefully it does its job. And when you go to the website, you find the things you need on it. But I'm just going to highlight 3 of the sections so you've got a kind of taster for what's there. One of them is what we're calling the net zero scorecard. So what we've done is we've taken a whole load of those types of actions that Adam talked about, having a cycle to work scheme, changing to LED bulbs, and we've put them into a fairly short survey. There's about 40 questions in, most of them are yes, no, or maybe. You go through and just answer against them what you've done, what you've not done yet, and you'll get a little score at the end that looks like this. It'll show you for those main different buckets how you're doing. And it will also then generate for you a series of emails over a course of about 5 weeks. Each email is tailored to the answers you've given. So if you said no to LED, for example, you'd get an email that said, you've not done LEDs yet. If you're in Scotland, there's funding to help you change to LEDs. Here's how you find it. So it's a really kind of tailored response. It's not a full carbon footprint. We intentionally didn't do that. We intentionally tried to get people to action really quickly. So if you want to kind of take that and get a sense of where your organisation's at just now, or take it as a team perhaps and discuss your answers, have a go at that. There's a link on the website to it. We've got loads of content on the website. Again, we're trying to get people to action quickly. So there's, again, the sorts of things that Adam was talking about, simple actions you can take under each of the main different buckets. And if you click on on each of these headings, it gives you a wee paragraph, why it matters, and a couple of links to where you can find support to take that action if you haven't done it already. There's a funding search on there. This is a Scottish specific funding search, so it's going to be more relevant if you're Scotland based, but it's all of the funds, loans, grants that are available to support with climate in its broadest sense. So there's a research there I did for energy, for example, and it'll bring up all the funding and support that's available around that. And then we've got a section on that sort of inspiration from others piece. So that piece that Adam was talking about how do we share what we're doing and use that to inspire other people. So there's a couple of examples here. CEIS is an enterprise charity up here. They have got a cargo bike. Scout Scotland have done work around food composters, at their outdoor activity centres. There's an organisation, they're one of the funders that has done the full carbon footprint. They're obviously a bigger organisation. It's important for them to kind of have that metric and begin to take action, and they've used that as an engagement tool. And there's another one there, Scottish Rural Action, who've done carpooling to help people get to their events. So again, for those of you that put stuff into the Menti earlier about actions you've already taken, there's a really simple way of sharing that action on our website. It'd be lovely to have more examples on there, so please feel free to go in and share some of your own examples and actions as part of that. For those of you that are in Scotland, where this is really relevant to you, this is just to explain what we're doing with this tool and the information on an ongoing basis. So we've done a soft launch. We've had it's up to about 10,000-ish sort of views on the website. We're up to about 250-ish scorecard completions. And what we're doing with all that data in the back end, so it's useful for the organisations that fill in the scorecard and get their own kind of action plan. But for us as an infrastructure body, we're then using that data in our conversations with funders and Scottish Government and others to identify where the needs are. So if there's a low number of organisations have a cycle to work scheme in place, for example, we're talking to Cycling Scotland about, here's the data, only 40% of organisations have got this. Can we use this to kind of develop further? And that's all the slides. So I'm going to stop my share, and hopefully we've got some questions coming through in the Q&A. So have we got anything in there, Adam? Have we looked?
Yes, there's a really interesting one I'd like to come to from, I think it's Marissa, from talking about harvesting rainwater. So the question is, can you talk a bit more about harvesting rainwater? What can we do with it once harvested? So the reason why I included water on those slides is that it's not going to be a big part of your carbon footprint. But linking back to what Beth was just saying around the kind of climate confidence site, it's about a bigger impact, right? There's more going on there. In terms of what you can do with it, some of the organisations are just mostly around. I'm trying to think, the main organisation we spoke to was, I think they were like an industrial unit. They were harvesting quite a lot of this because they were cleaning their vans, so they're doing a lot of van deliveries, but they were just spending so much kind of money, effectively, on just cleaning their vans. That doesn't need to be clean water. That can be done through kind of a water butt that just sits outside, collects that water, you put it in a bucket, that bucket then cleans the van, or you watering plants with it on site. The reason for that is just it builds in that resilience, is that you're not buying as much kind of water in. Locally, it means that any water runoff during heavy storms is going to be captured and therefore used more effectively. And it's going to be just a much better way of, rather than using kind of virgin water where we're hitting water shortages or hosepipe bans, well, actually, if you're cleaning cars, it can be done from kind of a water bucket. So anything where you don't need it to be kind of fully clean water to a certain extent. So obviously, you might be able to use it in some other processes, but if you are producing kind of food or goods, obviously not recommending it for that, but it can be useful just for cleaning things. There are also some other questions given to the chat. So
I was just noticing that there's ones in the chat as well as in the Q&A. So there's a question about, is there an England equivalent website? Good to know about what funding is available in England. So there's an England equivalent website, which is actually what we based our Scotland website on with their permission, and we kind of cribbed off them and made a Scotland version of it. Their one doesn't have a funding search on it just now, unfortunately. So it's been developed in the northeast of England, and it's called Going Greener Together. So you can have a look at that for kind of an England-based one. It doesn't have the funding search, but I guess going into one of the England-based funding searches and just filtering it to environment or climate could be a good start. To have a look at what's there. Some of the stuff on Funding Scotland will be UK-wide as well, so feel free to go in that and kind of choose the option for UK rather than Scotland in the filters. But in terms of how we maintain Funding Scotland, we really focus on the Scottish specific funding.
If I could just add to that, because obviously we work with a lot of small businesses, we're all over the UK. We find funding really difficult. It's incredibly fragmented. and it really depends on what region you're in and almost what postcode you're in, because some local councils or local universities might offer things like energy audits or kind of funding for solar panels, etc. Whereas then you go, 2 miles the other side of the border and it's not available. So I think it is something to look at really locally. At a national level, there are two main things that are funding available for at the minute. That is electric vehicle installation. So, like the charger installation and boiler upgrade schemes. It does tend to lean more towards domestic, but there are business rates available for that as well. So those are the two national ones: is installing electric vehicle charge points on your premises. You can get a grant. I think it's up to about 50% of costs. And then similarly for the boiler upgrade scheme, there is a bit of money available. I can't remember off the top of my head how much it is. So yeah, it's really difficult, I think, for knowing where the funding is coming from, because it does get very regional very quickly.
Yeah, great. If anyone knows of any other sort of funding sources that are good to look at for England, feel free to pop them in the chat for other people as well. Yeah. There's a question from John Woods about a supplier code of conduct that incorporates sustainability and carbon plans. We've got, so there's a template supplier code of conduct that we've put onto our website, which came from Cancer Research. So it's aimed at a pretty big, obviously Cancer Research are one of the massive kind of charities. So we've got their template code of conduct up there. We're actually doing some work internally at SCVO to make our supplier code of conduct publishable, because it's probably more relevant for slightly smaller organisations. I don't know if you've come across any other ones, Adam, that people have published their supplier code of conduct.
Not really. I think what we tend to see, because we do tend to work with kind of micros, so up to kind of 20 employees is sort of our sweet spot. A lot of them are just having conversations with suppliers that they know. There are some examples. There was a building merchant based in Sussex who actually did a lot of work engaging their supply chain to remove plastic from it. So things like screws that were coming in bags, they made them supply them in kind of cardboard, and had quite a lot of success there in going, look, this is going to be a problem for both of us in the future. How can we work together to try and fix this? I don't think it was as strict as sort of a code of conduct. I think that was just an open conversation with them to go, how can we help each other? So that's a really good starting point. I think picking kind of top 3 of your suppliers that you have good relationships with and just engaging them on this topic is a really good place to start. I don't think it needs to be particularly codified or complicated.
Brilliant, thanks. I was speaking to someone the other day from a national Scottish organisation that runs charity shops, and she was talking about they've made a real concerted effort to move so that all of everything that they sell in the shop is reused or recycled or comes from a fair trade certified supplier. I think they maybe had that in place already. So I'm sure, you guys will be the experts in this, but I would imagine that the charity retail part of retail is probably further ahead in thinking about what you sell in the shop, certainly, but obviously supply chain goes beyond that as well. Just going through them. Anyone with experience of supporting senior management teams and board in training and upskilling with sustainability, any recommendations on training? So I've got a couple of recommendations around this. One is a kind of something that we came across fairly recently, probably in the last few months. It's a tool called The Week. I'll pop a link in the chat, it's less about giving all the science behind. So it's not kind of carbon literacy training, which is also a really good tool, and lots of people provide that. But it's basically a series of 3 short videos that each last for about an hour, and you watch them as a group. So that works really well with like a board of trustees or a senior management team. Over the course of a week, you collectively watch these videos. You can do it online or you can do it in person. And it's designed to give you a real emotional reaction, I think, would be the best way of describing it, to the challenges that we're facing, and then to collectively talk about what are the solutions that are relevant in our context and in the organisations we're in and in the roles that we're in. It's really low cost as well, which is why I'm recommending it, because you pay about £10 per person to be part of the experience. So it's a pretty low cost way of getting a really good engagement, and it's free to use with communities. So if you're doing it within your workplace, it's £10 per person. If you want to use it with your customers or your wider communities, it's free to use as a community engagement tool. That's one of the most impactful things I've seen in terms of the various things I've seen organisations try to really get their staff engaged. So that's one option if you're looking for the sort of emotional bit of getting buy-in from people. We've also had experience of carbon literacy training. We've worked with Keep Scotland Beautiful up here, and sort of adaptation specific training as well, which can be really effective. Adam, you've maybe got a few other examples. I'll pop The Week in the chat just now.
Well, I think that covers it, to be honest with you. I think there's a lot of accreditations out there. Carbon literacy training is great, but the kind of the concern there is it is 8 hours. It's quite intensive because it is a very well kind of structured program. So something like the week where it is conversational and starting, and I think ideally could be localized to your sort of area is really key here. Just because climate impact is going to impact different areas differently based on that map we saw as well. This is a question that's come in from Daisy that I'd like to answer, if that's all right, around would our donors count as suppliers? Should we take into account their travel as part of our transport emissions? This is a really good question, and the answer is yes. I wouldn't worry about it immediately, but it's something to be aware of in that with transport emissions, there's several different categories of how you measure it, and I won't go into the details of kind of net zero scopes, but effectively you've got like things like business travel is one part of your emissions. There's visitor travel as well, and employee commuting. So employee commuting, how your staff getting to work, that's going to be a big part of emissions potentially. 2, business travel, are you flying to Amsterdam for a meeting, for example? That's going to be part of your emissions. And visitor travel is less required than those first 2, but I think it's a really important one to start thinking about. And the reason why I say that is we worked with a campsite last year on their carbon footprint. Very small campsite based in Sussex, 2 or 3 people kind of working there. We worked out that about 90% of their footprint was in visitor travel. It was around 70 tons a year of just people driving to their premises. That's not something they can directly control because they can't force everyone who comes to, cycle there, but they can work out how they can influence that of going, is there electric vehicle charging on site? Is there secure cycle storage? Is there a shuttle bus to the local train station? Are there trips they don't need to be making there? So I think they also included electric bike hire to try and reduce down the amount of miles being done by the visitors to the local villages so that it was done in a more kind of low carbon, more enjoyable way. So thinking about transport is going to be a really key one. It is about 1/3 of the UK's emissions. So really considering how you're tackling that and how you're providing for those elements, and even events, where are you hosting those events? Are they on out of town kind of retail parks? Are they on inner city near train stations? It's a bit of a soapbox moment of mine. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Great. So a few come through in the Q&A now. So one from Nick there, thinking about the nature of charity shops, customer donations. Could the idea of donating used goods be used as an offset count towards carbon zero, and how would you measure it? That's one for you, Adam, I think.
Yeah, short answer is no, unfortunately, Nick. So offsets, they have to be drawing down emissions. So offsets, again, is a whole separate webinar, but there's different types of offsets. There's avoidance and there's removal. Avoidance would be something like a solar panel where you're avoiding putting emissions into the atmosphere. Kind of removal is where you're drawing it down. So if you install something like if you planted a bunch of trees locally, they would then grow, they would take in carbon, that would be an offset. That's really the only offset that is allowed with net zero, is that removal element. So something like donating used goods, you can't really claim that credit, you can't measure it. It's a good thing to be doing for circular economy, but it's not going to count towards offsetting. Offsetting's got quite a narrow definition that is increasingly being refined purely because of some of the news articles and reports that are coming.
Great. So Carla's asked, do we have a sustainability template report for funders or boards? So I think there's a couple of bits to this. On our website, on the Growing Climate Confidence website, there's a template environmental or sustainability policy. So there's some recommendations in there about what you might want to include in a policy, and part of that is about setting yourself targets and being able to report against those targets around, as Adam said, if you're collecting data on staff commuting, for example, are you going to aim to sort of reduce the amount of staff commuting by car? But it's quite a soft template. Again, it's been designed for smaller organisations rather than for doing your full carbon footprint. There's also, do you want to talk about Hero, Adam? Would that be something to pick up on here?
Yes, it's a really interesting challenge we've had. So we've developed our Small 99 Hero platform, which is like a tech platform where it's got a list of the ideas that I showed you earlier, all broken down into 10-minute steps and kind of actions with further resources. It's completely free to access. So I'll pop a link to the chat if you are curious about that. On the reporting side, we do offer, the way we kind of provide those templates is very transparent. It's what have you done? What are you doing and actively working on? And what can't you do, or you can mark as do later? That's the best way we've found of doing this, because there's not really a clear template or guidance from government or from bigger organizations. And even the NHS, there's not really a set template from them to say, we want to look at, see it in this form. It is very much about storytelling and saying what you can do. The reason for that being different organizations are going to have different kind of levels of power and ability of what they can and can't control. So the format that we recommend is, what have you done? What are you doing? What are you going to do later? Is the best way to approach it. Thank you, Beth, for the linkage chat. Very efficient. Yeah, so I don't know. It's the biggest concern I've got in a minute is looking forward from our side, the resources that we're providing. How do we align it with what people want in the industry? And there's not yet clarity of what that looks like. So, yeah, I don't know if you're seeing anything from your side, Beth, but.
Yeah, not really. So part of the conversation we're having with the funders in Scotland is about whether a combination of our net zero tool and the hero reporting approach that Small 99 have got, if we could, it will never be a complete requirement because all funders will work differently, but if we could have one set way that we encourage organisations to use, that obviously is much easier for organisations, and it's easier for funders if funders are asking for evidence of this kind of thing. So that's the kind of, that's why we've been working in such a collaborative way. We're trying to find a way to make it easier for organisations. What I've seen from Scottish Government, for example, is fairly loose language around evidence of a carbon reduction plan or evidence of journey towards net zero. And they're still letting organisations kind of report that in different ways. So things like the Scottish Enterprise, or I think the NHS England one, where they're looking specifically at net zero and the scopes, they probably will be wanting a more robust kind of carbon footprint measure and evidence of, tons of CO2 that are not being chucked into the atmosphere. And again, if you're a larger organisation, that's much more relevant. If you're a smaller organisation, that feels a little less proportionate to us. So.
I'd say so. I think even within that, within the kind of the scopes 1 and 2 and the net zero reporting, there's still quite a bit of wiggle room of what that looks like. And if you've got a figure, there's not necessarily a level of kind of rigor that's being applied to it yet. I think that will come in the next year or so. But a lot of these organizations are very aware of how difficult getting that data is for small organizations. So.
Great. I'm very conscious of time. We've just got 3 minutes left. Are there any other questions we've not got to?
There's one that's just come in from Nick, which is quite a good one, of like what to do. So, it's quite a good example, Nick. So I always jokingly say, if you're moving from, pianos from Aberdeen to Brighton, then probably an electric fan might not be for you. I think this is where the idea of kind of control is really key, of going, actually, that's probably a part of your carbon footprint that you can't remove, because it is just such a kind of required. You need to use petrol for that or diesel for that because there's no options available. And in your plan saying, well, this is something we're working on that we're going to look at later, put it in that do later pile. It's not something that you can do or address right now. The only real alternative for that would be looking at operations and going, actually, could you use perhaps rail if it's over long distance, and then use kind of a hubbed approach? But even then, if it's furniture, I'm guessing that's probably not going to be appropriate. So I think you do sort of have to draw a line in the sand and say, these are the things that we can't actually change right now. Let's look at these later once the technology or once things kind of adapt. It's a difficult one, but a good question.
Right, I'm conscious that there's 2 minutes to the end. I'm sure there's probably other questions, but I'm conscious that people are very busy and I don't want to take up more of their time. So I think it's probably a good point to stop here. You can see that once people got going and you wanted the questions, there were so many coming through. And I think it's really sparked people's interest to kind of, how do they try and break it down? I mean, I really like the kind of bucket approach that you guys talked about. That's a really clear way of kind of, how do you try and group things together and then start to tackle them off one by one? And equally, what things you just can't do at the moment, and you can pause and revisit, because who knows, in a year's time there may be more options in terms of vehicle transportation that's available to our members. So I have certainly learnt loads, and I'm hoping that our members have learnt loads as well. So thank you for both of you for giving up your time this morning to do the presentation. If people weren't aware, this is being recorded, so this will kind of be distributed to everybody probably by the end of the day. So if you haven't managed to join live, hopefully you will get that and be able to watch it back. If you have joined live, you'll get a copy of the recording, and it might be something that you want to be sharing with other people in your team, or if you have a board member that's leading on sustainability. I know the kind of senior management board piece came up a couple of times in the Q&A, so you might want to share it with other people as well, and I think that it's really one for them to watch. So thank you very much for joining, and we will be sending out an evaluation, a copy of the recording, and then details of the rest of the autumn series as well, so do sign up for the future sessions. But yeah, Beth, Adam, I mean, amazing job, well done both of you. Thank you very much for giving up your time and sharing your insight with our members, and do make sure you check out all the resources that have gone into the chat. We'll also put those in the main body of the email that we send out as well, so people have got the relevant links that they want to follow up. So yes, right, 11 o'clock. That just leaves me to close down the webinar and say thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you,
Brilliant.
Adam. Thank you, Beth.
Thanks very much, guys. See you soon.
Thanks for
Take
having
care.
us. Yeah. Cheers then.
Bye.
Bye.